They all thought he was a fool, until he turned the courtroom upside down. The room was full of doubt the moment he walked in. The judge leaned back in his chair, tapping his gavel softly as if the case was already decided. The attorney on the other side let out a quiet laugh, adjusting his shiny cufflinks with ease. And the people in the gallery whispered to one another, shaking their heads. How could this man with his worn-out suit and tie that didn't quite sit right stand a chance against a polished lawyer? Yet he stood tall. His hands did not shake, his voice did not break, and his heart carried one simple truth. He wasn't there to prove himself. He was there to protect his grandmother's home. The judge glanced over the file, unimpressed. "Mr. Calloway, representing yourself?" The question came out with amusement, almost a smirk. The man met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes, Your Honor." A chuckle rolled across the courtroom, mostly from the attorney's side. The opposing lawyer leaned toward his assistant and muttered, "This will be over quick." The man heard it. He was supposed to. But he didn't react. He had been underestimated before, dismissed before. This was nothing new. What was new, however, was the chance to stand and fight back, with truth, with courage, with everything he had. The polished attorney rose first. His steps were slow and controlled, every movement a performance. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth, almost rehearsed. "This case is simple. My client followed the law. The property in question was rightfully taken through foreclosure. The facts are clear, the numbers don't lie. This is not about emotions. It's about contracts, deadlines, and obligations." He gestured toward the man without even looking at him, as though he were a ghost in the room. He refuses to accept reality, but reality does not bend to denial. The attorney gave a small nod and sat down, folding his hands as if the trial were already finished. All eyes turned to the man. He stood slowly, adjusting his tie, though it never sat straight. He cleared his throat. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady though the room expected him to falter. "Mr. Sterling is right about one thing. The law is clear. But the question is, did his client actually follow it?" For the first time, the judge looked up with a flicker of curiosity. The attorney smirked, whispering under his breath. But the man didn't stop. "I've spent the last 6 months studying every case, every statute, every loophole banks use to strip homes away from families. And I found something. Something that changes everything." The word he spoke next cracked the room like thunder. "Fraud." The silence that followed was heavy. The chuckles stopped. Even the attorney's smirk faded for just a second. The judge leaned forward. "Fraud? What are you suggesting, Mr. Calloway?" The man lifted a folder. "That the foreclosure on my grandmother's home was based on forged documents. And I can prove it." He walked the papers to the bailiff, who handed them to the judge. "These are 2 copies of the mortgage agreement, one from the original filing, and one from a later modification. If you look closely, you'll see the signatures don't match. The second was signed 3 months after the first, when my grandmother was in the hospital after a stroke." "She couldn't have signed it?" Murmurs spread through the gallery. The judge's brow furrowed as he compared the documents. The attorney shifted in his seat, his confidence suddenly less certain. "Signatures change," he argued. But his words sounded thinner now. The man pressed forward. "And there's more. This mortgage was sold 3 times before it landed with the current lender. But the last transfer, it was never properly endorsed, which means the bank that foreclosed never had the legal right to do so." Again, the bailiff carried papers to the bench. The judge's jaw tightened as he flipped through them. The room felt different now, less certain, more uneasy, and then came the final blow. "Your Honor," the man said, "I'd like to call a witness." A ripple of surprise spread across the courtroom. The attorney shot up from his chair. "This is irregular." But the judge allowed it. The doors opened, and a woman stepped in, the notary who had stamped the second mortgage document. Her voice trembled, but her words hit harder than any evidence so far. She admitted she had never witnessed the grandmother sign. She had simply been handed the paper by the bank and told to stamp it. The courtroom gasped. The judge leaned forward, his face hard. The attorney sat down, his confidence shattered. The man took a breath. "Your Honor, given the false signature, the broken chain of ownership, and this testimony, I move to have this foreclosure nullified. My grandmother's home was stolen through fraudulent means." The judge tapped his gavel, his voice clear. The court rules in favor of the defendant. The foreclosure is void. The property is to be returned immediately. The man exhaled, his shoulders finally lowering. Months of late nights, endless research, and constant doubt had led to this single moment. He glanced at the attorney, who now sat hollow, defeated. But he didn't gloat. This wasn't about revenge. This was about justice. As he stepped outside into the fading sunlight, people whispered around him, "That man should be a lawyer." But he didn't need their validation. He already had what mattered most. His grandmother's home was safe, a voice called out. It was the judge standing at the top of the courthouse steps. "You surprised me in there. Ever think about law school?" The man gave a quiet laugh. "Not really," the judge smirked. "Maybe you should. You've got a talent for making people squirm." With that, he turned back inside. The man shook his head, smiling faintly. Law school or not, one thing was clear. He had shown them all that power doesn't just belong to the rich and polished. Sometimes it belongs to the underestimated, and when they rise, they don't just win, they change everything. The courtroom seemed to lean against him before he had even spoken. The air was heavy with doubt, the kind that comes when everyone believes they already know how the story ends. The polished lawyer sat comfortably, his suit pressed to perfection, his shoes shining like glass. He looked like he owned the room, and in a way he did. This was his playground. Every glance, every movement told the jury that he had done this 100 times before, and every time he had walked away the winner. And then there was the man across from him. His suit had seen better days. His tie leaned to one side, and his folder of papers looked worn from being opened too many times. He wasn't a lawyer, not by training or profession, and everyone could see that. To the judge, he was just another ordinary man who thought he could beat the system. To the attorney, he was nothing more than an inconvenience, a bump on the road to another easy victory. To the people in the gallery, he looked like someone walking into a storm without an umbrella. The judge tapped his gavel lightly, leaning back in his chair as though this case were already a waste of his time. His voice carried a hint of mockery when he said, "Mr. Calloway, representing yourself?" The words floated across the room like a taunt. "Yes, Your Honor," the man replied, steady as stone. No flinch, no pause. A chuckle rose from the attorney's side. Even the assistant covering notes couldn't hide the smile tugging at her lips. The attorney whispered loud enough for his client to hear. "This will be over before lunch." His confidence was the kind that filled a room like perfume. Thick, overwhelming, impossible to ignore. The man heard it all. He wasn't meant to ignore it. The whispers, the smirks, the rolling eyes, they were designed to remind him of his place. He wasn't one of them. He didn't have years of legal training, a team behind him, or the privilege of polished experience. All he had was determination, late nights with stacks of law books, and the memory of his grandmother's smile every time she sat on the porch of the house they were now trying to take away. For a moment, he let his eyes travel across the room. Every glance carried judgment, some amused, some pitying, some just indifferent. But when his gaze returned to the judge, he spoke with a calmness that unsettled even the silence. "Your Honor, I don't believe I can argue this case," he said, letting the room hang on his words. The attorney smirked, certain the man was admitting defeat. But then he finished, "I know I can." The chuckles turned into muffled murmurs. Even the judge's smirk faded just enough for curiosity to slip in. Something about the way the man said it, so sure, so unshaken, didn't match the image of someone walking into a battle they couldn't win. The judge sighed, flipping through the file with the disinterest of someone skimming a book they had no intention of finishing. "Very well. Let's proceed." His tone said he wasn't impressed, but his eyes betrayed something else, a flicker of intrigue he hadn't expected to feel. The attorney leaned back in his chair, confident and relaxed while the man stayed perfectly still, his folder balanced on the table before him. On the surface, he looked ordinary, unremarkable, even tired. But behind those steady eyes was a storm that hadn't yet broken. He wasn't there to look like he belonged. He was there to prove that he did. The attorney rose from his chair with the ease of someone who had rehearsed this moment countless times. His suit jacket slid into place as he buttoned it with a casual flick of his hand. His polished shoes clicked against the courtroom floor as he walked toward the jury, each step measured, deliberate, like a man performing for an audience that had already bought their tickets. He didn't look nervous, not even a little. Confidence wasn't just something he carried, it was something he wore like a second skin. He had been in this courtroom too many times, against too many people just like the man sitting across from him. And in his mind, the ending was always the same. He won. They lost. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth and clear, filling the room without effort. His tone was practiced, polished, as if it had been carved from years of victories. "This case is simple." He spread his hands wide, a gesture meant to show openness and authority. Then he lowered his voice slightly, just enough to draw the jury in closer. "We have here a man who refuses to accept reality." He didn't even glance at the defendant as he gestured in his direction. It was almost as though the man wasn't worth looking at, like he was just a shadow in the corner of the room. "The property in question," the attorney continued, "was rightfully acquired through legal foreclosure. My client followed the law. Every contract, every deadline, every obligation was met. The numbers don't lie." He paused deliberately, letting the silence work for him. A few jurors shifted in their seats. The gallery listened, some nodding faintly. It was the kind of moment when words wrapped themselves around people, persuading them before they even realized it. The attorney tilted his head slightly, his voice softening as he went in for the emotional touch. "Now I sympathize," he said, almost with a sigh. "Losing a home is painful. It is tragic. But pain does not override legal responsibility. The law is not about feelings. It is about facts. And the facts here are clear. My client did everything by the book. Mr. Calloway did not." He let the words sink in, then casually adjusted his cufflinks again as though the case were already tied neatly with a bow. His eyes swept across the room, landing briefly on the judge as if to say, "We both know where this is going." Finally, he turned and walked back to his seat with the calm of a man who believed his work was already done. The judge leaned back slightly, rubbing his temple as if bored by the thought of another drawn-out argument. The gallery shifted and one or two muffled laughs came from the attorney's side. They believed him. The confidence in his voice had convinced them the fight was already finished. But the man sitting quietly at the defense table didn't move. He didn't frown, he didn't show anger, he didn't even look shaken. He simply waited. His folder sat in front of him, filled with papers worn at the edges from hours of study. His eyes stayed steady, fixed not on the lawyer but on the judge, because deep down he knew something the others didn't. The attorney's performance was strong, convincing, smooth. But it was also hollow, and soon, everyone in that room would see just how fragile that confidence really was. The room was still humming with the attorney's words when the man finally rose from his chair. He didn't move quickly. He didn't puff out his chest or try to make himself look bigger than he was. Instead, he stood with a quiet steadiness, the kind that made people glance twice, not because he demanded attention, but because he carried a calm that didn't belong to someone about to lose. He cleared his throat once, the sound small compared to the attorney's booming performance just moments earlier. A few people in the gallery leaned back, already expecting him to stumble. But when he spoke, his voice came out firm and measured. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen," he began, looking not at the gallery but straight at the judge. "Mr. Sterling is right about one thing. The law is clear." For a second, the attorney smirked as though the man had just admitted defeat. But then came the pause long enough to draw the room back to him. "The question," the man continued, "is whether his client actually followed it." The gallery rustled. A couple of heads tilted. The judge, who had been leaning back in his chair with a sigh, shifted forward ever so slightly. He didn't speak, but his eyebrows rose, a flicker of interest appearing where there had only been dismissal before. The man took a slow breath and let his words roll out, steady and sure. "For 6 months," he said, "I have studied every statute, every case, every loophole that banks and corporations use to take homes away from families like mine. And in those months I found something." He paused again, not because he was nervous, but because he wanted every eye, every ear, locked onto him. And now they were. "What I found," he said, lowering his voice just slightly, "is fraud." The word landed like a stone dropped into still water. A ripple of silence spread across the room. The smirks faded. Even the attorney's assistant looked up from her notes, caught off guard. The laughter that had once filled the gallery was gone, replaced with the kind of quiet that demanded attention. Judge Grayson straightened in his seat, his fingers pausing mid-tap against the gavel. "Fraud?" His voice wasn't amused now. It carried something sharper, more cautious. Are you suggesting that the foreclosure was fraudulent, Mr. Calloway? The man nodded once. Yes, Your Honor. I believe the foreclosure on my grandmother's home was based on forged documents. And I can prove it. That's why I'm requesting discovery. The attorney let out a low laugh, shaking his head like a teacher humoring a child. Absurd, he muttered loudly enough for the gallery to hear. He doesn't know what he's talking about. This is nothing but a stall tactic. His voice was calm, but his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. The man didn't look at him. He kept his focus on the judge. With your permission, Your Honor, I'd like to submit evidence that shows the signatures on the mortgage documents don't match. One was signed when my grandmother was already in the hospital recovering from a stroke. She couldn't have signed it. The gallery whispered, voices overlapping in shock. The attorney's smirk faltered just for a moment before snapping back into place, but the damage was done. The room wasn't laughing anymore. For the first time that day, the judge wasn't dismissing the man in front of him. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing on the folder the man held in his hands. His voice, once laced with condescension, now carried something else, curiosity. Bring it forward, he said. The man walked his worn folder to the bailiff and placed the documents inside. His steps were calm, but his chest carried the weight of everything he had prepared for. He didn't just bring papers, he brought the truth. And in that moment, as the bailiff carried the evidence up to the bench, the entire courtroom shifted. The polished attorney might have owned the stage at first, but now, for the first time, he wasn't the only one speaking with authority. The man they had mocked, underestimated, and written off as a fool had just spoken one word, fraud, and it had cracked the ground they all stood on. And deep down, even the judge knew it, this case was no longer the easy win it had seemed. Something had changed, and the man who was supposed to lose might just have something no one saw coming. The papers landed in the judge's hands with a soft rustle, but the weight of what they carried pressed heavy on the room. Judge Grayson adjusted his glasses, flipping through the pages slowly at first, then more carefully, his eyes narrowing as he compared the two signatures. The silence was so sharp you could almost hear the turning of each page. The man didn't rush. He stood steady, his gaze fixed on the bench, waiting for the judge to see what he had already seen 100 times in his late-night hours at the kitchen table. Your Honor, he said, his voice calm, these are two copies of the same mortgage agreement, one from the initial filing and one from a modification filed just 3 months later. If you look closely at the signatures, he pointed with a steady hand. They don't match, the judge's brow furrowed. He leaned forward, holding both documents side by side. The gallery began to stir, low murmurs breaking the silence like ripples across still water. People craned their necks, straining to see what the judge was looking at. The attorney shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but quickly forced a smirk back onto his face. Signatures change over time, he said, his voice carrying that same polished smoothness, though thinner now, less certain. Handwriting can vary. This is a weak attempt to confuse the issue, but the man didn't flinch. He stepped closer to the table, his voice steady. Maybe signatures do change over time, but this second one was signed only 3 months after the first. And if you'll notice the date on that modification, he paused, his eyes locked on the judge. That was the day after my grandmother was admitted to the hospital for a stroke. She couldn't hold a pen, let alone sign a legal document. A sharp murmur broke through the courtroom, louder this time. Someone in the gallery gasped. Another leaned forward, whispering to the person beside them. Did he just say she was in the hospital? The atmosphere was shifting, brick by brick, moment by moment. The judge's eyes moved slowly back and forth between the two signatures. He pursed his lips, tapping the edge of the page with his finger. Mr. Sterling, he said, his tone firmer now. Do you have an explanation for this? The attorney hesitated. It was small, barely a blink, but in that pause, the man knew he had struck something solid. Your Honor, the attorney began, his voice tighter now. This is an exaggeration. An attempt to paint my client in a false light. The documents are valid. There is nothing unusual about unusual. The man's voice cut through, not loud, but sharp enough to slice the attorney's words in half. He took a step forward, his hand brushing over another document from his folder. Tell me, Mr. Sterling, is it unusual for a bank to foreclose on a home when the last company to own the mortgage never actually had the legal right to it? The attorney froze for a fraction of a second, just long enough for the question to settle in the air. The judge leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing with sharper focus now. "Explain yourself," he said. The man lifted another sheet of paper, his voice unwavering. "Your Honor, this mortgage was sold 3 separate times. Each transfer of ownership should have been backed by a signed endorsement. But if you look closely at the last transfer," he walked toward the bailiff, handing over the document with careful hands. "There's no signature, no endorsement, which means the lender who filed this foreclosure never legally owned the loan in the first place." The gallery erupted into a low roar of whispers, the kind of noise that happens when people realize the ground beneath their feet is shifting. Even a few members of the jury leaned forward, their curiosity breaking through their practiced stillness. The judge studied the document with a new intensity. His fingers tapped against the bench, not in boredom this time, but in thought. He looked over at the attorney. "Mr. Sterling, is this true?" The attorney straightened his jacket, his jaw tight. We would need time to review these claims, Your Honor." His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed the flicker of something else. Nervousness. The man didn't let go. "Take all the time you need," he said, his words calm, almost casual. "I'll wait." It was subtle, but the power in the room had shifted. The attorney, once so polished and untouchable, was suddenly on the defensive. The judge, who had begun this case with smirks and sighs, was now staring hard at the documents in front of him. And the gallery, once laughing quietly at the sight of a man representing himself, now watched in silence, caught between shock and anticipation. For the first time that day, the laughter was gone. In its place was doubt, not about the man, but about the very case that had once seemed impossible for him to win. The attorney tried to steady himself, but everyone in the room could see it. His polished armor was starting to crack. His jaw tightened. His hand tugged at his cufflinks again, but it wasn't with confidence this time. It was nervousness disguised as habit. The man at the defense table waited, watching. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. He had one more move, and it was the kind no one saw coming. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but it carried through the room with sharp clarity. "Your Honor," he said, "I'd like to call a witness." The gallery erupted with murmurs. Heads turned. A few people even leaned forward on the wooden benches, eyes wide. This was unexpected. The attorney shot up instantly, his voice raised. "Objection, Your Honor. This is highly irregular. This witness was not disclosed." Judge Grayson raised his hand, cutting him off. His patience with the attorney had worn thin. He turned to the man. "A witness, who?" The man straightened. "The notary who stamped the second mortgage modification, the one with the forged signature." Gasps rippled through the gallery. The attorney's assistant scribbled furiously in her notebook, her pen almost scratching through the paper. The attorney himself stiffened, his confident mask slipping further. "Your Honor, this is outrageous," he snapped. "This cannot be allowed." But the judge wasn't looking at him anymore. His eyes were fixed on the man who had, piece by piece, shifted the entire balance of the room. After a long pause, he said, "I'll allow it." The back doors creaked open and the sound echoed through the silent courtroom. Every head turned as a woman walked in. She wasn't dressed like someone ready to stand in front of a jury. Her steps were small, hesitant. She carried the kind of nervous energy that made people instinctively lean in, sensing something important was about to happen. She made her way to the stand, adjusting her glasses, her fingers trembling slightly as she placed them on the railing. The bailiff swore her in, and then she looked toward the judge. "State your name and occupation for the record," he instructed. "Linda Myers," she said softly. "I'm a licensed notary public." The man stepped closer, his voice steady but gentle. "Miss Myers, do you recall notarizing a mortgage modification for my grandmother, Alma Calloway?" She hesitated, her eyes darting toward the attorney before landing back on the man. "Yes," she said finally. Her voice was almost a whisper. "And were you present," the man continued, "when she signed that document?" The silence stretched. She adjusted her glasses again, her lips pressing together as though the weight of the answer sat heavy on her chest. Finally, she shook her head. "No, I wasn't," the gallery gasped. Someone muttered, "She wasn't even there?" The judge's eyes sharpened, his gaze cutting from the witness to the attorney. The man pressed forward. "Did you see anyone else sign on her behalf?" Her hands gripped the stand tighter. "No." "Then how?" the man asked, his tone calm but insistent. "Did you stamp the document?" Her shoulders slumped. She swallowed hard. A representative from the bank brought it to me. They told me it had already been signed and they just needed my stamp. I trusted them, so I notarized it. The words hit the room like a hammer. People in the gallery gasped again, louder this time. The jurors shifted forward in their seats, their faces a mix of shock and disbelief. Even Judge Grayson leaned forward, his face stern and unyielding now. The attorney jumped to his feet, his voice sharp. "Objection! This is hearsay. This witness cannot verify the legitimacy of..." "Overruled," the judge cut in, his tone carrying no patience. He turned back to the witness. "Miss Myers, do you understand the legal implications of what you've just admitted?" Her eyes filled with guilt, but she nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. I didn't know at the time, but I should have. I should never have stamped that paper." The attorney sank back into his seat, dragging a hand down his face. His confidence, his swagger, his smooth control, it was gone. He looked smaller now, cornered, his eyes darting as though searching for a way out. The man didn't smile, didn't gloat. He simply turned back to the judge. His voice was even, almost quiet. "Your Honor, that document was notarized illegally, which means the foreclosure itself was illegal." The courtroom wasn't laughing anymore. The same people who had doubted him, who had chuckled when he stood in his wrinkled suit, now sat frozen in their seats. They weren't watching a fool. They were watching a man who had just pulled the rug out from under a giant. The courtroom was no longer the same place it had been an hour earlier. The smirks were gone, the quiet laughter silenced. Even the air felt heavier, as though everyone inside was holding their breath, waiting for the next move. The judge's once dismissive expression was now sharp and focused, his eyes locked on the stack of papers in front of him. The polished attorney, who had entered with confidence dripping from every gesture, now sat hunched, his jaw tight, his fingers tugging at his tie like it had suddenly become too tight to breathe. The man stood steady, his folder nearly empty now. He had laid out every piece of evidence step by step, like a puzzle slowly revealing its picture. He didn't rush. He didn't gloat. He simply turned to the judge one last time, his voice calm but carrying the weight of every sleepless night he had spent preparing. "Your Honor," he said, "with the forged signature, the missing transfer endorsements, and the testimony we just heard, the truth is clear. This foreclosure wasn't legal. It wasn't right. My grandmother's home was stolen through fraudulent means. And today I'm asking this court to give it back." The words hung in the air. The gallery was silent. Even the sound of the ceiling fan seemed to fade. The judge leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He tapped his gavel against the bench, not in impatience this time, but in thought. His eyes scanned the room, the weary but determined man at the defense table, the shaken attorney who had lost his composure, the jury leaning forward, waiting. Finally, Judge Grayson leaned forward, his voice firm and clear. "This court rules in favor of the defendant. The foreclosure is void. The property is to be returned immediately." The sound of the gavel striking the block echoed like thunder. The man let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His shoulders dropped, his grip on the table loosening. Months of research, months of doubt, months of people telling him he didn't stand a chance. Swept away in a single ruling. The attorney slumped back in his chair, his face pale, his eyes hollow. The man looked at him briefly, but there was no gloating in his gaze. This wasn't about revenge. It never had been. This was about justice, about protecting what mattered most. As he stepped out of the courtroom, the late afternoon sun spilled across the courthouse steps. The air outside felt different, fresher, like the world had shifted slightly back into balance. People from the gallery filtered out behind him, whispering to each other. He caught fragments. "Did you see that?" He destroyed him. That man should be a lawyer, but he didn't need their words. He didn't need validation. All he needed was the thought of his grandmother walking through the front door of her home again, safe, untouched, still hers. That was enough. He paused halfway down the steps, closing his eyes for a moment as the sun warmed his face. For the first time in months, his chest felt lighter. He had fought the fight no one thought he could win. And he had won, a voice called out from behind him. "Calloway," he turned. Judge Grayson stood at the top of the steps, hands in his pockets. The arrogance that had laced his tone earlier in the day was gone, replaced with something else, something almost respectful. "You surprised me in there," the judge said, his voice steady. "Ever think about law school?" The man let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. Not really, Your Honor. The judge smirked just faintly. Might want to reconsider. You've got a talent for making people squirm. With that, he turned and disappeared back into the courthouse. The man stood for a moment, staring at the doors as they closed. Law school? Maybe, maybe not. That wasn't the point. The point was this. When everyone had counted him out, when they laughed at the idea of him standing alone in a courtroom, he hadn't backed down. He had taken every doubt, every insult, every smirk, and turned it into strength. Because power doesn't just belong to the rich, the polished, or the ones with titles. Power belongs to those who refuse to surrender, even when the odds are stacked against them. And sometimes it's the underestimated, the ones nobody believes in, who rise and change everything. As he walked down the courthouse steps, the evening sun stretched shadows across the pavement. His fight was over, but the lesson remained. Justice isn't handed down to the loudest voice or the strongest suit. Sometimes justice comes from the quietest person in the room, the one brave enough to stand when no one expects them to. And on that day, in that courtroom, the man who was supposed to lose proved that courage can shake the world.